Well, look what the cat's dragged in. Couldn't stay away, could you? Have you missed me, dear listeners? I sure missed you. It's a dark and stormy night, and after the week I've had, I'm glad for the company. If you're new to town or just new to this whole radio thing, I'm Barbera Knight, and you are listening to Arkham Night Radio. Let me be your guide of the weird, your ferryman across the river Styx, your conductor of the strange and unknown. And I guarantee you, dear listener, this episode is going to be stranger than usual, because I can confirm that I now have first-hand experience with the paranormal. Not some cheap parlor trick conjured by some mystic trying to squeeze a buck from a grieving widow, but rather a real, actual experience. And I'm going to tell you all about it. Mr. Lenny Valentine, Mr. Archibald Farwell, and yours truly was hired to investigate a piece of property inherited by a Mr. Knott in central Boston. I knew both gentlemen beforehand. Mr. Valentine from a shared acquaintance of ours from my time studying in Boston. I would describe him as a huge man with a hard exterior, but with a high intelligence and a softer side hidden beneath. And Mr. Farwell is a long-time listener of the show. He's handsome enough and with more money than sense. I've seen the effect he has on people, and I can't argue with his results, even though I contribute it to the size of his wallet rather than his charm, as he would have you believe. I'll tell you a bit more about these gentlemen at a later date, since I strongly suspect I'll be seeing a lot more of them. Mr. Knott, the landlord, contacted the Paranormal Research Society because strange things keep happening at the property to the degree that the earlier tenants, an Italian family of 4, were driven mad by the experience. We are talking locked up at Roxbury Sanatorium, mad. I spoke with both the parents. Or rather, I spoke with the woman, since all the man did during our encounter was frantically repeating the phrase, "By his own weapon is the devil rested." I still can't say what he meant by that with any certainty. The woman had some interesting things to say, and it was clear to me that she had been through a lot, hell even, and that she was convinced that the house was haunted. I won't extrapolate on the things she told me, since you'll be hearing about my first-hand experiences soon enough anyway. I'm telling you this because I want you to know that we did our research. We thought we were prepared. It would turn out we weren't. A visit to the library confirmed that the property that Mr. Knott inherited was the infamous Corbett House, named so after its second owner, Mr. Walter Corbett, whom bought it from its original owner soon after it was built in 1835. After the first owner fell ill under mysterious circumstances, I might add. That's not strange in itself, but it adds to the mystery concerning Walter Corbett. In 1852, he is sued by his neighbors, who petitioned to force him to leave the area in consequence of his serious, sick habits and unsuspicious demeanor, clearly not popular amongst the neighbors. At this point, we were itching to take a look at the place. First, a quick stop at Dooley's Tobacco for 2 packs of Camel for myself, and some outrageously expensive cigars for Mr. Archibald. Mr. Dooley did share his experiences with the Corbett house and the family recently living there. As in that, he told us he heard it was haunted, and that the husband had been screaming about a man with burning eyes. He also told us that offices and businesses have replaced the 19th century homes in the neighborhood, and the house in question, with its overgrown front yard, is now the only private residence left on the block. I don't know why, but it felt important somehow. Something that will be made apparent during this and future investigations is that money makes people talk. And Mr. Archibald has loads of it, and charm to spare, I have to admit. The green content of his wallet compared to my green eyes. Let me tell you, this girl doesn't stand a chance. The old Corbett house was overshadowed by taller, newer office buildings on either side. The house fronts the street. The garden and grass were overgrown, clearly not tended to for some time. I was impressed by the way the house seemed to withdraw into the shadows cast by the flanking buildings, and how the blank curtained windows hid all understanding of what lay within. For such a busy neighborhood, the old Corbett house felt very isolated. Inside the house, the first thing we noticed was that the windows had been nailed shut, all the curtains drawn, in every room, as previously stated. There was dust on the furnishings as expected. It looked by all accounts like a home for a family of 4, an overabundance of religious iconography, perhaps. But I'm a Catholic girl myself, so I can relate. If half of the things I've heard about this house was true, religious iconography would be the least of the thing I would use to ward of whatever haunted this place. Nothing except the nailed windows seemed all that strange at first, except perhaps an overbearing feeling of being watched and some strange noises. I was a firm believer in the paranormal beforehand, but tried to keep a skeptical approach to the whole situation. Easier said than done. I think that both Mr. Valentine and Mr. Farwell suspected that all the talk about ghosts was getting to me. I admit that I was more tense than I had any right to be at this point. The basement stairs turned out to be our greatest obstacle so far. First of all, Mr. Valentine is an absolute unit of a man, and isn't built for traversing such fidgety old stairs. So he stayed behind, making sure no one sneaked up on us, while me and Mr. Farwell went on ahead. Or at least that was the plan. Me walking in front of Mr. Farwell proved to be too much of a distraction for the poor boy, and he took a tumble down said stairs, almost costing him his life, a serious concussion and a bruised ego. Later, Mr. Valentine instead joined me in the basement, while Mr. Farwell enjoyed a rest in the kitchen. During all this, need I remind you, dear listener, that we've been hearing some strange noises. Also, the lights had been coming and going. The tension in the air was palpable. Suddenly, a dagger flies through the air and tries to do short work of both me and Mr. Valentine. I'm not implying there were an assassin skulking around in the basement throwing knives. No, we are talking full-on poltergeist activity. This dagger came at us time and time again, levitating through the air. If it wasn't for some quick thinking and creative use of a garbage can on Mr. Valentine's part, both this investigation and our lives might have ended early. Poltergeist dagger disposed, we continued our search of the basement. Soon we found a crawl space of sorts hidden behind some boards. Unfortunately for Mr. Valentine, we also found a gathering of rats driven on by otherworldly anger and hatred for mankind. A small exaggeration perhaps, but they were really huge and ill-tempered, I assure you. He suffered some bite wounds from the diabolic vermin, but eventually managed to chase them off. In the crawl space, we found the words, Chapel of Contemplation, written in scratchy letters on the back wall. A clue, we thought. We then decided to take a break from the cellar and check in on Mr. Farwell upstairs. On a side note, I didn't expect my nursing background to be as useful as it turned out to be for this investigation. Clearly suffering a concussion, Mr. Farwell explained all of our experiences so far as nothing more than mind ghosts, and actually implying that I might have gotten a bump on the head myself. Realizing that both my fellow investigators at this point needed some medical attention, I quickly searched through the rest of the house. I almost got killed by a goddamned bed, or rather a poltergeist hurling a bed at me. This wasn't witnessed by the other investigators, of course, adding to Mr. Farwell's impression of me seeing things and this place getting to me. After finding a set of notebooks, we called it a night and headed back to our hotel for the evening. These notebooks turned out to be Walter Corbett's diaries, describing his various occult experiments, including the summoning of some spirit, and mentioning something called the Opener of Ways. After we studied these diaries for some time, Mr. Valentine, being a Boston native, recalled that a church, or rather cult, as I think he referred to it, called Chapel of Contemplation, was somehow involved in, or suspected to be the cause of, some children going missing way back. and that it ended in a bloody police raid with several dead on both sides. It was a big scandal at the time. Being a journalist in Arkham, I thought it strange that I never heard of this even though it happened a couple of years ago. With some more leads to go on, we continued researching the house, Mr. Corbett, and the Chapel of Contemplation. Evidently, Corbett won the lawsuit instigated by his neighbors. His obituary in 1866 states that he still lived in the same place until his death. It also states that a second lawsuit was being waged to prevent Corbett from being buried in his basement, as provided by his will. We couldn't find any outcome to the second lawsuit, but that's a quite strange request, don't you think? No wonder he was unpopular among the neighbors. We did our due diligence in regard to this investigation. No stone was left unturned. Information proved to be hard to come by, harder than it should have been. Eventually, we got our hands on a file containing a secret raid on the Chapel of Contemplation. The police raid was occasioned by affidavits swearing that members of the church were responsible for the disappearances of neighborhood children. During the raid, 3 policemen and 17 cult members were killed. Autopsy reports are singularly lacking detail and uninformative, as though the coroner had not actually performed examinations. Though 54 members of the church were arrested, all but 8 were released. The records hint of illegal intervention in the proceedings by an important local official offering stories of the battle, the biggest criminal action in the city's history, that never appeared in print. This whole thing stunk of a cover-up, and I pointed that out in a heated argument to a manager at the Boston Globe, earning myself a lifetime ban from the establishment. Pastor Michael Thomas, who's the executor of Walter Corbett's will and the head of the church, was arrested and sentenced to 40 years in prison on 5 counts of second-degree murder. He escaped from prison in 1917 and fled the state. The main question remained, what was causing the haunting and how do we stop it? Was it the murdered children, the dead cultists, or Mr. Corbett himself, perhaps? Or did he manage to conjure some otherworldly spirit using the occult texts in his diary? All valid questions. The one thing that spurred us into action was a question that, in comparison to the raid and cover-up, seemed like a side note. What happened to Mr. Corbett's body? Was it buried in the basement? We needed to find out. We grabbed some tools and informed the landlord, Mr. Knox, of the eventual need for some sudden renovations of the basement and headed over to the Corbett house for the last time. The house was dark, silent, like a tomb, if you will. It didn't stay that for long. As if it was knowing our intentions, the haunting intensified. There were loud footsteps, banging on the walls and blood dripping from the ceiling. Mr. Farwell had to admit that it was something more going on than nerves this time. Set to our task, the 3 of us headed for the basement. In the hidden part of the cellar, where we found Chapel of Contemplation written, we started to tear down the wall. This is when Mr. Valentine shouted in pain, and the knife we restrained earlier was now sitting firmly in his shoulder. Mr. Valentine grappled with the specter, or knife, or whatever it was, while Mr. Farwell and I hurriedly continued our work on the cellar door. Soon enough, the plank gave way, and an entrance to another room revealed itself. Lying motionless and seemingly dead on a pallet in the center of the room was a drawn, wooden-looking, wizened figure of some 6 feet, skinny and naked, with ghastly wide flaring saucer-like eyes and a nose like a knife blade. Some sort of chain rested around his neck. He has lost all hair, and his shrunken gums make his teeth look very long. From him came a sharp, sweet, churning scent, like rotten corn. The floor was earthen, and there was a table in the southwest corner with some curled papers on it. Occult writings, I suspect, but because of the state of them, they crumbled in my hands at closer inspection. I examined the body on the pallet, drawing the perhaps obvious conclusion that this was in fact the late Mr. Corbett. Then the thing grabbed me. Mr. Corbett had risen from his grave in the form of this necromantic abomination and attacked us. A fight ensued. I can still hear the ringing in my ears after Mr. Farwell fired his rifle in that enclosed space. With no small part in due to both my companions, we managed to defeat the undead Mr. Corbett, with the whole thing coming to an end with me blowing his brains out with my .38. And that's how the haunting of Corbett House ended. No warding rituals or setting the spirit of the haunting to rest. Just some good old-fashioned violence. I feel that this was just a test for greater things to come. There is much to ponder and reflect upon. My worldview as forever changed with this experience. Sure, I was a believer beforehand, but seeing is something else entirely. I can no longer ignore the truth that's been hidden right under the surface. I think that's where we will end it for tonight, dear listeners. I would like to thank the Paranormal Research Society for this opportunity, and many more like it in the future. I will leave you with this quote. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. Good night.